So I conduct research in fisheries science, and I'm what you might call a fisheries stock assessment scientist. And when I go to cocktail parties or non-scientific events and people say, what do you do for a living? I say that I try to figure out how many fish are in the sea and how many are safe to catch without crashing the population. And that really is the essence of my research. I try to figure out new and better ways to get more accurate estimates of how many fish are out there and how sustainable our fisheries practices are. And I think sustainable seafood is really important because for us humans, it's one of the last food products that we still harvest wild from the earth. And so what I'd like to talk about tonight is some of the challenges and some of the trends in sustainable seafood and how we estimate whether that seafood, whether the fishing practices are sustainable. So some of the questions I'd like to tackle tonight. Thank you. Thank you. Whew, this is a good crowd. I like you already. Some of the questions I want to tackle tonight are first, what do we mean by sustainability? If you ask your fishmonger or your fisherman or your restaurant chef or the person sitting next to you, all of them will come up with different answers as to what they think a sustainable fishery means. So we'll talk about that. Also, it's important to know where your seafood comes from if you're going to determine whether it's sustainable or not. And I'll talk about some of the trends in that in a moment. And then I'll transition to talking about how do we determine as scientists whether a fishery is sustainable. And then I want to leave you with a few tips and tricks, if you don't already know, how to identify sustainable seafood. How many people here eat seafood or go fishing? Okay, that's most of you. So hopefully you have an interest in this topic. But before I start, I want to start with or delve into all that. I want to start with two definitions so we're all on the same page. And the first term that I've already used in my introduction that you may not be familiar with is this term stock. We talk about fish stocks, right? And essentially, for the purposes of this talk tonight, what I'm referring to is a fish population. So I'm talking about all of the fish of the same species that interbreed within a certain geographic region. So for instance, all the striped bass on the East Coast from Maine to Florida are managed as one unit stock, one population. So that's what I'm talking. I'll use and interchange those terms throughout the talk, but that's what I'm referring to, a whole population of fish. And the other really confusing term I'm going to use is the term fishery, which you may not think is all that confusing, except that I'll talk about things like crab fisheries or sea urchin fisheries. There are fisheries. Fisheries are basically any operation where you're removing seafood from the water. So we can have actual finfish fisheries, crustaceans, like I mentioned, sea urchins, sea cucumbers. In some places in the world, marine mammals, sea turtles, and even kelp has a fishery management plan. And that's not even an animal, right? So when we talk about fisheries, we're talking about the act of creating seafood and removing it from the water. So now that we have those two terms down, I'm going to launch into the first question that I want to tackle, and that is, what is sustainability? Now, at the very core of the idea of sustainable seafood, we're talking about whether or not the fishing rate that's being applied, the rate at which we're fishing and removing animals from the population, will cause a long-term decline such that the population can't reproduce itself and will ultimately crash, right? That's what we're worried about. We're worried about whether we're harvesting those animals at too high a rate that will cause a population crash. And I think we can all agree that that kind of fits with the concept of sustainable. If it can't go on forever, it's probably not sustainable. But if you talk to certain folks, and it depends on which organization or which person you're speaking to, they may have a broader definition of sustainable fisheries. So they may be looking at other aspects, not just whether that individual species is going to crash as a result of the fishing practices, but whether other animals in the ecosystem will crash as a result. So one of the things that may happen when we fish is that, let's say we're targeting tuna, and we want to catch tuna, but by accident we're catching sharks as well. We can't keep them out of the net for whatever reason. And that may result in mortality. Mortality we call bycatch mortality. It's not intended. It's not necessarily anything that the fishermen wanted to catch, but the fishing practice for, let's say, tuna may result in the deaths of other animals, and that may not be sustainable for their populations. And so we see that with various fish species, crustaceans, seabirds, marine mammals and turtles, and sharks and other species. So that's one consideration. Another consideration is what the effects of the fishing gear may have on the habitat. So for instance, this here is a trawl that's dragged along the bottom of the ocean. And in some habitats, maybe it's sandy or muddy, it doesn't have a big long-term effect. But if you drag that net over a coral reef, let's say, that might have really intense long-term consequences, right? And so that may not be considered by some to be sustainable. Now, the other component of the ecosystem that we often don't like to admit is humans. Humans are part of the ecosystem too, right? And there are severe consequences to global fisheries if they aren't sustainable, and those can have effects on human populations. So this is a map of each of the countries around the world, and the percent of their animal protein in their diet that country gets from fish products. So you'll notice that the percent of fish in the protein in the diet of folks, for instance, in sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia is quite high. I think it's 3.1 of the 7.4 billion people in the world get more than 20% of their protein from fish. That's a lot of folks. And if global fisheries aren't sustainable, that could result in malnutrition for a large number of people around the world. So there are human considerations as well to fisheries sustainability. Now you may be looking at this map and seeing the United States as having a really light color here, indicating that less than 10% of our animal protein is coming from fish. And you may think to yourself, well, we're probably not having a big impact on global fisheries, right? I see some heads shaking. No, that's probably a leading question, right? The US is the largest importer of seafood products in the world. We get 91% of the seafood that we eat in this country is coming from other countries, from abroad, overseas. And where is it coming from? Most of it is coming from China, Canada, and Southeast Asia, with some additional imports from South America, Chile and Ecuador. Does anyone know what's the #1 seafood consumed in the United States? Shrimp. Oh, shrimp. Well, you guys knew that one. Shrimp. Very good. 27% of our domestic imports here are shrimp. Americans love to eat 3 things when it comes to seafood. Shrimp by far, followed distantly by salmon, and then tuna. Tuna fish sandwich, you see it everywhere, right? Shrimp, salmon, tuna, shrimp, salmon, tuna. That's what Americans consume. And yet most of it isn't raised or caught here in the United States. Where's our shrimp coming from? Most of our shrimp is coming from India, Southeast Asia, and Ecuador. Not the Gulf of Mexico, although if you can find it, it's very tasty. Most of our salmon, I don't have a graph for that, but most of our salmon is coming from Canada or Chile in South America. And most of our canned tuna is coming from Thailand. The vast majority is coming from Thailand and other Southeast Asian countries. And so you might be thinking, all right, so most of the seafood that we consume here in the US is coming from abroad. But I know you've all heard about domestic fisheries. You know that we're harvesting fish here in the United States. What is it that we're harvesting? Ironically, the US is home to the largest fishery by volume in the world. Does anyone know what species that is? And you can't answer because you're my class. What was it? No, actually it's not. But keep that in mind. Menhaden is this is a relatively distant second.
I didn't hear it.
What's the largest fishery by volume in the US? Oh, they said Menhaden. That is a very large fishery. It's the second largest fishery. We'll get back to that. The largest fishery. No, not salmon. Not cod. Not striped bass, catfish. Nope. I'm getting a feeling you don't know. It's a fish called walleye. Sorry. It's a fish called walleye pollock or Alaskan pollock. Okay? You don't usually go to a restaurant and see walleye pollock on the menu, right? Nobody's probably. But if you've ever eaten a fish stick or a fillet of fish sandwich or imitation crab meat, you have probably eaten walleye pollock. Okay, but most of the walleye pollock in the United States is not consumed by us. We export it. So that's the irony, right? Now, getting to your favorite, the second largest fishery in the United States is menhaden, most of which is actually caught in the Gulf of Mexico, but we do have a sizable fishery here on the East Coast. But again, you're not going to go to the restaurant and find a filet of menhaden sandwich, right? They're really oily. But you will find that those products, when we take a menhaden, we reduce it down into two major products. The first is fish meal, which gets used to feed our livestock. So you do end up consuming it very often. And the other is the oil, and that ends up in your omega-3 fatty acid pills that you get at the drugstore, or perhaps as a supplement in some of your other foods that you may eat. So the big irony is we produce a lot of fish products by volume in the US, and then we don't actually consume most of it, especially not in the traditional fashion of in a restaurant or on the dinner plate, whatnot. So, knowing all that we eat most of the fish we eat coming from abroad, but we do have some very large fisheries in the US, you might be wondering, what are the trends? Are these fisheries sustainable, right? Well, let's take a look globally and work our way in. If the United Nations Fish and Agriculture Organization tries to keep track of the status of stocks globally. And if you look over time, over the last 40 years, from the 70s through to today, the percentage of stocks that are overfished, meaning the population size is dangerously small, it's a little too small, proportion of stocks that are overfished has gone from about 10% to about 30% worldwide. And the percentage of fully fished stocks has gone up as well, taking up the rest of that. Now, what we mean by that is that we're fishing at a rate that is the maximum sustainable rate we possibly can, or somewhere near that. Okay, so there's no room for expansion is what it means. It may be sustainable, but there's not a lot of wiggle room. And then if you notice here, the percentage of underfished or underexploited stocks back in the day was about 40%, and now it's about 10%. So there's been a kind of a negative progression towards more overfished or fully fished stocks. What's happening in the US, though? If you ask NOAA Fisheries, which is our federal agency responsible for managing federally managed fish, they will say that 84% of our stocks are not overfished and about 16% are. Now, that's way better than the global average, right? It was about 30% globally are overfished, and about 16% in the US are. So that's a great improvement. And know that the trend in the percentage of overfished stocks in the US has gone down. So we're making improvements, and that's great. And when people ask me, are US fisheries sustainable? I give them a kind of crazy face because I'm not sure how much detail they want to know. But since you're here tonight and you're dedicated, I'm going to give you the caveat to this answer, which is that this is great. This is a great rate. 16%, we could do better. But know that most fish stocks in the US aren't federally managed. They're managed by the states. They're either inland fisheries, or they're fisheries that are prosecuted within state waters in the ocean from the shoreline out to 3 miles. So the federal government isn't involved. And we're talking about fisheries like our iconic blue crab fishery here in the Bay. It's managed by Maryland and Virginia. The paddlefish fishery in Mississippi provides American caviar, also managed by the states. Dungeness crab, if you've ever gone out west, wonderful product, managed by the states. And among these stocks, we think about 70% of them, we don't have estimates of whether or not they're overfished. We haven't done the science, we haven't crunched the numbers to know. They may be fine, there may be problems, but we just don't have the science to get that answer. So my caveat is we're doing well in the United States. We're probably one of the top countries with regards to fisheries management. We've got problems, we've got a long way to go, but compared to other regions of the world, we're doing pretty well. Know, though, that we don't even know the status of a large portion of our stocks. So that's my caveat. Does that make sense? Okay, so now you know the full answer. Sorry about that. So I want to transition now to talking a little bit about why we don't know the answer to whether our stocks are overfished or not in many cases. And one of the problems is that we can't just go out and count the fish, right? It's not like wildlife. You can't pick up your binoculars and count how many deer or birds are out there. We don't have X-ray vision. We can't look into the sea and count them. So we need to collect a wide variety of data and try to model that population and piece together what we think is going on. And that data collection program is very expensive. Here in the US, one of the reasons why we're doing relatively well compared to the rest of the world is that we have the funds to be able to do that. In many developing countries, they just don't have the resources. Not that they're not interested, but they're devoting the resources they have to other things. So let's talk about the science behind sustainability. What type of data do we need to collect to figure this out? And what kind of information can we glean from that data to try and figure out whether our stocks are overfished? And the first thing that we typically do is we gather data from the fishery, whether it be commercial or, especially in the US, recreational. Now, commercial fisheries are monitored based on a process where the fishermen go out, they catch the fish, they bring it back to the dock, they offload it, and they sell it to a dealer who purchases that from them and then sends it through the market chain, right? Throughout history, they were doing that largely for tax purposes. They were keeping records of exactly what was caught and how many pounds of which fish, right? And now we're able to use that long history of catch information to track performance of the fishery. It's become that data collection has actually become part of our fishery management plans in many regions. So for instance, this tuna that's been landed, we know exactly how many pounds of that species of tuna was landed in what day, in what region of the country. And we can use that to monitor the fishery. But things get a little trickier when we start talking about recreational fisheries, because now those folks are recreationally fishing, they're anglers, they're not allowed to sell the catch. There's no dealer to keep those records. And so what we end up doing here in the US is we conduct a scientific survey where we go out and through a variety of means we interview or question anglers about what they caught. And when we can, we actually intercept them when they get out of the water or on the water and ask them very specifically, what did you catch? What did you throw away? We look in their bucket. We measure the fish that are caught. And we do that to try and get an estimate of how many fish are harvested by recreational anglers. It's not perfect, but it's one of the best systems in the world, and it's one of the most thorough, actually. So that's how we get at this information. And I'll come back to this length information, but keep that in the back of your head for a moment. And I just went the wrong way. Now, the fishery data is really important because it tells you at least, you know how many animals were removed from the population, right? That's a huge piece of information if you want to try and get at what the fishing mortality rate is. But it only gives you part of the picture, right? It tells you very detailed information about the fish that were caught, but it doesn't tell you anything about the fish that weren't caught, right? And because of the various minimum size regulations and bag and trip limits and whatnot that many of you who fish know all about, that makes it such that the fish that we catch aren't necessarily representative of the whole population. So what we do as scientists is we send folks out either from agencies or academic institutions, and we conduct what we call surveys. And then what we're essentially doing is we're going out on a boat and we're fishing. But we're not fishing the way that fishermen fish. Now, fishermen are smart. They're going to try and go to the places where the fish are highest concentration so they have the best chance of bringing home fish. But scientists are interested in getting a broad view across the whole range of the stock of what's going on. And we're often trying to get information, get a kind of a bigger bang for your buck on multiple species, right? So we're going to do kind of a scientific sampling protocols all up and down the coast, typically is what happens. And what we're able to do with that information is get a picture of what the trends in the stock might have been. So for instance, this is the Federal Trawl Survey, and these are the catches on the East Coast. So this one goes from southern New England down to Cape Hatteras. And these are the catches, the kilograms caught per tow of summer flounder in that survey in each of the seasons that they go out, whether fall, spring, winter. And you can see the population goes up in the 70s, down through the 90s, and then back up again by the 2000s. What this is telling us is it's giving us a snapshot of what the whole population is doing. Right? It's not just the fish population, it's all the fish that we encountered along the way, what that total population trend might be. And that's huge information that we use in our assessments. The other thing that we do is when we go out and try to when we collect these animals, we try to get as much information about them as we can, about their biology. So if we have them in hand, we will take lengths, we will weigh them, we will get information as best we can about what age they are. We'll try to get information on whether they're egg-bearing. How many eggs are they producing? Maybe we'll measure their gonads. We can get information about their diets by inspecting their stomach contents. We can get tons of information just from these scientific surveys. And when we can, we'll even tag them and release them to get other information about their migratory patterns and also what their mortality rates might be. The other really critical piece of information that we get from these scientific surveys is information about the juvenile fish. If you think about it, the recreational commercial fishermen aren't really allowed to or interested in catching small fish, right? So if you want information about how many juvenile fish are being produced over a time series, you need to go out as scientists and collect that. And oftentimes we're talking about really tiny fish. So these are all striped bass. They're really small little guys, right? This is a lobster the size of the tip of your finger. You're not going to get information from the fishery about baby lobsters unless you go out there as scientists and collect it yourself, okay? So that's one of the key things that we can get if we invest in these surveys. So we get all this information. We've got information on catch. We've got information on the lengths and the ages of the fish and what their trends are in the survey and how many juveniles are produced, all this information. And then we take that back and we look for certain signs, certain trends in the data that indicate that overfishing may be occurring. Some of the things we're looking for, first, are there declines in these data sets? Those scientific surveys that I discussed earlier, if you see declines over time like we did with summer flounder in the 70s and 80s, that's a warning signal that perhaps something's going on. We also look at juvenile fish production. If suddenly, you're going along and occasionally you get a good year class and then it's fine, and then you stop getting good year classes of juvenile fish, that's a dangerous sign as well. And we'll also measure, when we can, the fishery catch given the effort that's expended. And that trend can be very informative. So for instance, let's say the fishermen go out one year and they catch 100 fish, given a certain amount of effort. The next year they go out, they catch 50 fish, given that same amount of effort. And the next year they go out, they get 25 fish, same amount of effort. What's happening to the population? It's probably going down unless something changed in the fishery, and that's where it's important to work with the fishermen on this, to be able to interpret that data properly. And then one of the classic signals that we look for, remember when I showed you that picture of the scup on that measuring board? One of the things that we're looking for, both in the fishery and in the scientific data, is changes in the length and age structure of the population. And by that, I mean, when you have a largely unexploited or lightly exploited fish stock or population, you tend to see a wide range of fish of various ages, right? Maybe out to their maximum age. And as you start to harvest them and the fishery starts to have an impact, they tend to have an impact first on the oldest, largest fish. So we start to see fewer and fewer of those bigger, older fish show up in the catch and in the surveys over time. And that's one of the signals that we look for when we're trying to measure what impact the fishery is having on the population. And then finally, if we can, and we have the information, we try to look at sex ratio. For some fisheries, this can be a big indicator of a problem, in that if it's all males, you're not going to have no offense guys, a very productive population. You need a decent sex ratio of some sort in order to make sure that stock can sustain itself. So with that in mind, I wanted to give you an example of one of the assessments of a stock that I've done recently, and give you an idea of the type of information that I had available and what I was able to produce with it. And it's a really cool fish and fishery. So who's ever heard of golden tilefish? Or any tilefish? Yeah, a few of you. That's good. They are a species that's found up and down the East Coast. They are huge, big fish. Yeah, offshore deep sea fish with very bright colors. They're absolutely gorgeous. Golden dots and bright blues, and they have this big pouty mouth. They're great. And they do this crazy thing that they build these burrows in the muddy silt sand that they hang out in, and then they stick themselves in head first with their tails sticking out, and nobody knows what they're doing in those holes. No scientists, we've had lots of theories. Nobody knows why they go in these burrows. They just go in there, stick their heads in, and and hang out. When they abandon them, it's actually kind of interesting. They end up becoming great habitat for crabs and lobsters and other organisms, but we don't know what the tilefish actually use them for. But that's a diversion. As I mentioned, they like to live offshore, but they're very finicky. They really like this narrow band between these red lines of deep habitat, but it's relatively warm. And so they're very concentrated in a certain area and therefore kind of vulnerable to fishery exploitation. Now, in the South Atlantic, which, here, let me show you. The line here is the Virginia-North Carolina line. Okay, so I'm assessing the stock from North Carolina to Florida. And what I have at my disposal, first and foremost, was the catch information, how much the fishery landed over time. And what you'll notice is that early in the time series, there isn't much catch. There wasn't a big fishery. There was barely any fishery, honestly, for tilefish in the South Atlantic until the 80s. And then you see it took off, right? There's these really high catches of tilefish. And then the population, that was a bit much for the population. It declined a bit. And by the 90s, we ended up having a fishery management plan in place and quotas, maximum harvest regulations set for this fishery. And as you can see, it kind of leveled off. The catch leveled off at a slightly lower level after that. So I had this information. And I also had information on the effort that the fishery expended, so how much gear they put out to catch that amount of fish. I had information from one scientific survey that's conducted off the coast of South Carolina. So it's only a small portion of that range, right? And I had information about the length and age samples from the fishery and the survey, but primarily from the fishery. So with that information, I was able to take all that, look for the warning signals that I mentioned earlier, and plug that data into a statistical population model. I'm not going to go through the details of that tonight, but I will show you one of the results of that population model. And it's just a pretty graph, but I'll walk you through it. So this is a plot of the numbers of tilefish estimated to be in the population over time. So starting back in the 60s, going through to 2012. Each of these boxes, the different colored boxes, is the estimated numbers at age. So this first line here represents these reds and oranges are the young fish, ages 1, 2, 3 or so. The yellows, greens, and blues are your kind of tween and teenage fish. And then the purples and pinks are your old 20-year-old fish. They can live to be 25, 26 years old. What's the first thing you notice in this graph? Oh, yeah, okay, you caught the two things that I wanted you to notice. The first is that you see the population decline when the fishery first opened up, right? And then later in the time series, you see it expanding again, right? That was after we had implemented quotas and fishery management plan. The other thing that I heard people shout out was there's no pinks and blues left in the population. Where did the 20-year-old fish go? Back in the day when the fishery first started, we caught big old fish in the fishery and in some of the scientific surveys that are out there. Not that one survey didn't exist at the time, but mostly in the fishery. Now you don't see those pinks and purples anymore, right? There's no more 20-year-olds in the population. Let me take a step back. What the stock assessment estimated is that by this time we were overfished. The population was a bit too small relative to the harvest that was being removed. But with the quotas, the establishment of the fishery management plan, as you can see, the population came back. And look what we're seeing now. Some of those teenagers are showing up in the population again. So this is exactly the type of information I was talking about before, where we can track the age structure of the population and get information about the fishery removal rates and whether they're sustainable or not. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. So that's the golden tilefish stock. Currently it's considered not overfished, and it's still up for debate as to whether we're overfishing. Or we can take a quick question, yeah.
How old do the fish have to be able to reproduce?
That's interesting. So these guys are very strange. Tilefish actually reproduce at a younger age than you might expect. So some of them are reproducing as young as 4 or 5, which you wouldn't, well, they're maturing, I should say. Whether they're successfully reproducing, that's another question. But they are susceptible to the fishery by about age 7 or 8 in general. Yeah, good question.
So what that shows is the stock that can reproduce is significantly reduced in the later years.
In the later years. Oh, because there's fewer younger fish here?
There's fewer older fish,
Oh, yes, exactly.
If they have to be
Exactly.
87 or older to reproduce, there's not that many compared to how it used to be.
Right, so I would say these ones that are the light green to blue are reproduction age fish. So compared to back here, you're exactly right. You're not getting the bigger, older, very fecund fish anymore. So its capacity to be able to withstand high fishing rates has gone down. But it's improving, which is a good thing. Cool. Good. So that's my golden tilefish assessment, but that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg with regard to the kind of research that we do here at CBL with regards to sustainable fisheries. So almost all of us work in some fashion on Atlantic menhaden and trying to improve our fishery management for that forage fish. And several of us work on blue crabs. Tom just left the room, but he's our main man when it comes to blue crab fisheries dynamics. And then there's also folks working on oysters and sturgeon, you name it. We've got folks here who are working on local Chesapeake Bay fisheries and fisheries like golden tilefish that are being conducted around the world. But before I wrap up, I just want to leave you with a little bit of information about how you, as a seafood consumer, can try to navigate the world of sustainability. So short of coming to CBL and getting your PhD in fisheries science, which would give you way more information than you needed, I was hoping that if you don't already know, you could get some information here tonight about how you might be able to make some seafood choices that you consider to be sustainable. Because remember, if you ask 5 or 6 different people, they might give you a different answer. So you need to decide for yourself what you think is important with regards to the seafood that you consume, and then, if you're interested, purchase in that fashion. So there are key questions that you need to ask, either your fishmonger or your chef, or do some research on your own. And I'll give you some resources. You can get phone apps if that's your thing, or you can go online and study it, or you can ask questions of your local fisheries scientist if you want to. And those 3 key questions should get you the answer to whether or not that stock is sustainable. The first question is, where was that seafood caught? So the same species caught in 2 different places may be sustainable or not, depending on how hard the people are fishing in each of those different locations. The second question you want to ask is it wild caught or aquacultured? And I'll get to why in a minute. The third question, what fishing gear was used? Remember how I mentioned that depending on what type of gear is used and where it's used, that can have an impact on the ecosystem. That's what I'm getting at here. So depending on the combinations of the answers to those 3 questions, it can get very confusing, but it can also get you to the right answer, the answer you might be looking for. Now, you may not have the time or the interest in doing all the research that's necessary to figure out exactly what's going on at any given time when you happen to be at a restaurant or at the grocery store. So one quick and dirty way to try and move more into the realm of purchasing sustainable seafood is to look for these eco labels. These are labels that are assigned to seafood products where an organization has gone through and reviewed the fishery practices and the fishery management plans associated with that fishery and determined whether or not they think it's sustainable according to their criteria. The question is it the same criteria that you would use, right? Some of them are very minimal and some are very rigorous. But at least if it has a stamp on it, like this Marine Stewardship Council stamp, like this walleye pollock fillet of fish sandwich from McDonald's. Not that I'm just saying, this is an example of a product that has been certified sustainable, and you can look for that label, and it gives you a quick and dirty way to try and determine if someone has tried to figure out whether or not this is a sustainable stock or not. So eco-certification is one option, but I will warn you that there are some problems with eco-certification and eco-labeling. The major one being that just because it doesn't have a label doesn't mean it's not sustainable. So what happens is that these fisheries go out and they apply to the organization that does the eco-certification and ask to be reviewed. So if the fishery hasn't actually gone out and asked to be reviewed, they're not going to get the label whether they deserve it or not. So just know that just because it doesn't have a label doesn't mean it's not sustainable. Does that make sense? Okay, good. So some of our local fisheries aren't eco-certified in any fashion that I know of, like our blue crab fishery, Atlantic croaker here, striped bass, but they're relatively sustainable compared to many other seafood products that you could purchase. And they're local, which is great, right? So keep that in mind. And I'm going to give you a few rules of thumb that I use. And you can argue with me. I'm happy to discuss this at length. But in general, if the method that's being used to harvest is very labor intensive, it's probably has less of an ecosystem impact. So for instance, this is pole caught or hook and line caught tuna. So that's where individual guys go out in a boat and they literally drop a line over to catch tuna, as opposed to dragging a big net and catching a bunch of other species. So there's still problems with this fishery, don't get me wrong, but the broader ecosystem impacts are a little bit less than they are for other gears. Diver caught shellfish is going to, in general, they're literally going through and picking these animals out by hand. It's very labor intensive. It's going to be much more expensive. It may not fit in your budget, but in general, these are more sustainable practices from an ecosystem perspective than some of our other fisheries. And I've been talking a lot about wild-caught fisheries, but keep in mind that aquaculture is another option. And we can debate the pros and cons of aquaculture, but American aquaculture in general, especially shellfish, is relatively sustainable from an ecosystem point of view. So for instance, this is an aquaculture farm in Virginia waters. This is an aquaculture farm for tilapia in the Philippines. So that's why I said American aquaculture in general is more sustainable, and this is a broad generalization, take that with a grain of salt, but our water quality monitoring programs here in the US and our fishery permitting programs for both wild-caught and aquaculture are so much more rigorous than most other regions of the world that in general, if you're going to use a rule of thumb, then probably your American aquaculture products are going to be in general more sustainable for the ecosystem than many other aquaculture products around the world. And I say that not because for instance, you may not care much about the ecosystem in China or the Philippines. I do, but you may not. But even if you don't, know that these products, because the ecosystem effects can be quite nasty, those fish and shellfish products often have to be treated with antibiotics, antifungals, any drugs that they can get their hands on in order to try and keep those seafood products alive and to your market. And so the US Food and Drug Administration actually monitors seafood imports as they come into port. They sample them, and they actually will refuse them and send them back if they don't meet our standards. But again, they're sampled, so some of them do slip through. But know that some countries like China and Vietnam and Indonesia have a large portion of our seafood imports refused at the door in the US, in large part because toxins are showing up at high levels in those fish and because they're showing up with banned antibiotics that aren't used here in the US for various reasons. In September alone of this year, 20% of our imported shrimp were refused at the door because they were using banned antibiotics. So it's a concern, and I would warn you against it. And actually, I'll just say one more thing. If I do have a little bit of time, let me say one more thing. I could talk about this all night. The one area where this can get confusing, though, is I don't want you to think, oh, all foreign aquaculture or wild-caught products are bad. But you also need to read the label very, very carefully, because a lot of what's happening now is that we have sustainable products here in the US are shipped overseas for packaging because the labor is cheaper and brought back to the United States. So it could very well be a sustainably harvested stock, like for instance, pink salmon in Alaska, sustainable, MSC certified, eco-labeled, all the gold stars, gets shipped very often because it's on the West Coast and labor is cheap in China, shipped to China, packaged there, sent back here, and the label may say product of China. So it gets really confusing really fast. And again, if you don't have all the time in the world to worry about this, one thing you can do, I don't know, did we hand out those cheat sheets? Yes. Okay. Anyone who would like a Seafood Watch cheat sheet, this is just one of the tools you can use, are these little pocket guides. Seafood Watch from Monterey Bay Aquarium is just one of the guides out there. There's plenty of them. You can get apps for your phone, and they provide you with some information, like very general. These are the green ones are your best choices. The red ones you probably want to avoid. Those aren't as sustainable fisheries. But it doesn't necessarily provide you with the whys. And it may not be the same definition of sustainable that you would have. Like maybe you only care whether or not the stock is gonna crash. Maybe you care about sea turtles, that's your big thing. Or maybe you care about coral reefs, maybe that's your thing. And you can't tell from this card necessarily what that decision would be. And the other thing is that this is a regional card, this is for the Southeast. But you'll notice that a lot of the products on there aren't harvested in the Southeast, they're not local. And a lot of them, I noticed, I can't get them. In Prince Frederick, I can't think of a place in Prince Frederick I could get a bunch of the things on that card. So it's not as helpful as you might like, but it's a nice, quick guide. So if you're at the grocery store, boom, you can have some guidance, right? Or you can go on their website and learn more about it. But I highly recommend for folks who are really into this and want to learn more about it, that you go to a website like noaasfishwatch.gov and type in, like I did here, American lobster is my favorite. I used to work on them a lot. Type in the seafood that you currently eat a lot of and learn about it and figure out what's the population doing, not just globally. Here, they're giving you information, Gulf of Maine, Georges Bank, Southern New England. They're telling you very specifically where in the US the populations are good and where they're bad. They're telling you about the fishing rates, telling you about bycatch, habitat impacts. If you scroll down on this website, you'll get tons of information. So start with the stuff you currently eat. Learn more about it. That's my recommendation to most folks, and you can move on from there. So that's my presentation. I'm more than happy to stay and answer as many questions as you have already. That's wonderful. Thank you. She's got a fast arm.
Well, I stress when I buy seafood because I've heard so many different things, and I'm not sure I'm that clear, but I've also heard that you think, okay, so aquaculture, it's not being taken away from the wild, but then I've heard that they grind up fish from the wild to feed the aquaculture, and then they're destroying the wild too, so I'm lost.
Okay, I didn't have time. You told me 40 minutes. And I took 45. There's so many things I wanted to talk about, that being one of them. So if you are aquaculturing piscivorous fish that eat other fish, you have to feed them fish, right? At least at the moment. There's some research going on to improve that, right? There may be some new technologies very soon where we don't have to do that. Oh, sorry, yeah. So that would be one. So you have to worry about the fact that you may be over-harvesting the predator, your aquacultured fish's food. So let's say you're aquaculturing salmon and you're feeding it menhaden. I'm making that up.
Yeah.
If you're overfishing menhaden to feed the salmon may be fine because they're aquacultured, but maybe your menhaden aren't, right? That's what you're at. Yeah, it is a concern for piscivorous fish that are aquacultured. But I think that's going to change very soon, would be if it gives you any hope. Now, there's also fish like tilapia, for instance, barramundi, I think, too, are vegetarians. So there are aquaculture options of fish, fin fish, that you can get that eat vegetation rather than other fish. So that eliminates that concern. And shellfish, if you can eat it and you like it, they're filter feeding from wherever they're planted or aquacultured, right? And so they're helping to filter the water to some extent or another, but they're not eating fish. They're eating, tiny little plankton.
Soylent Green.
Soylent Green, yeah. Like oh, you both came up at the same time. Can I go with him? I won't forget you.
On this little cheat sheet, there's Atlantic salmon, which is a species, and it doesn't differentiate between Atlantic salmon from Chile and Atlantic salmon from Maine. How do you tell the difference?
Does it say farm raised? It should say farm raised Atlantic salmon. Chile? Does it say Chile?
No, it doesn't say Chile, but I happen to know that you see it often.
See, this is where the guides, they don't give you all the details I want you to have. So, for instance, what he's talking about is that Atlantic salmon are on the East Coast. They're terrible shape. They're pretty much very, very they've been historically overfished. There's no wild fishery for them, but they are aquacultured in Chile. Now, there's no salmonids native to South America, so it's kind of a good idea in the sense that the aquacultured fish aren't going to mix with the wild native fish because there's no native salmon in Chile. So if you're going to eat farm-raised salmon from Chile, that's not a bad option. If you manage to somewhere find wild-caught Atlantic salmon, I don't know where you would, that would be illegal. If you find it, let me know, or call your local.
But is Atlantic salmon farmed here?
It is, I believe it's farmed in not Atlantic.
Some's farmed in British Columbia, and some's farmed in
Norway.
and
Right.
Northern, and Scotland.
Scotland. Yeah, sorry, Dick, you're next.
Back to the tilefish. What are they? What kind of? Are they filter feeders, or what is their nutrient? And what are they caught for? Are we consuming those as?
So the first question was, what do they eat? What do the tilefish eat that I mentioned, the golden tilefish? They are kind of, they eat a lot of different things. They eat some fish, but they're primarily eating crustaceans. So like me, they love crab, they love lobster, if they can get their hands on it. But we do find fish in their diets. And there's some new diet studies going on that we'll see if that changes the answer. But at the moment, to the best of my knowledge, they're eating primarily benthic crustaceans. And then you asked also, what are they used for, right? Tilefish are a super tasty, white, sweet-fleshed fish that we consume, if you can find it. The biggest fishery right now is in Florida. So if you go to Florida, that's where you're most likely to see it in a restaurant. Or at a seafood specialty counter, although I've seen it in my parents' home in New York. It was on the menu there. But there are two different populations in theory, the northern and the southern stock. So, yeah.
Just one other follow-up. It seems to me one of the risks of aquaculture you mentioned, which is using something else and using it up, doesn't exist for anything that's a filter feeder. For example, oysters.
Right.
You don't have to feed them. I suppose you don't have to put any kind of pharmaceuticals on them.
Exactly. That's one of the reasons why I had them on the recommend list, especially if they're aquacultured here in the U.S., where we have decent water management, Clean Water Act. Let's just say. Now, Dick, I know you had a question.
Yeah, when a fish stock collapses, crashes, as you say, I'm thinking of cod.
Yes, cod.
But I see cod all over the place on menus.
Yeah. Okay, so Dick's asking about cod. He's heard about the infamous collapse of Atlantic cod. I use the word Atlantic. Pacific cod are in decent shape. So most of what you see, if you see cod around here on the menu, is Pacific cod. But you want to ask, because there still is some bycatch of Atlantic cod, and it will show, especially if you're like in New England, you may see some of it on the menu.
Is it possible it will come back?
Oh, that's the million-dollar question. Will cod come back? They've been overfished for quite a while. The rate of bycatch, there's currently no directed fishery, but they're caught as bycatch in other groundfish fisheries, and so there's still mortality on them from the fishery. And there's concerns that with climate change, the environment may not be the same as it used to be, and the recruitment of young cod may not be as favorable as it might have been in the past. And so whether they're going to come back or not, even though we don't have a directed fishery on them, I hope they do, but there's no guarantee. I wish I had a better answer for you about that. Yeah, in the back.
So a scientist like you does one of these assessments, and then what? I'm asking then, what's the lag time until it's implemented? Because theoretically, by the time your study, I'm just picking on you.
Yeah,
right
please.
here.
I'm the target.
Right? By the time your study has caught maybe a decline, there's already been a lag time, and then there's more of a lag time before any sort of management practice goes into place.
It's a small pump.
Yeah. Okay, so the assessment, let me give you the full answer, because we have time, right? What kind of time do we really have? How long do you want to be here? Okay. So by the time an assessment like the one I've done is completed and delivered to the fishery managers to make the decision, the data is usually already 2 to 5 years old. because it takes us at least a year to do the assessment usually. And it takes a year to get all the data together. From all those different sources I mentioned, there's a reason it takes forever. So already, by the time the package is delivered, it's 2 to 5 years old. Then the fishery managers deliberate over it. If they're not really geeked to do anything about it, they will often kick the can down the road through various means for a while. How long they do it depends on which management structure is in place. Some react immediately, and that's great, and within the fishing season, within a few months, there's a change. For instance, with golden tilefish, the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council did not like the answer I gave them. So there are two. They liked the part of the answer when I said it wasn't overfished. So you know how the stock was going up again at the end? That's good. Everybody likes to see that. The other metric I didn't show you because it's harder to explain is the overfishing metric. And that means the rate of fishing on the population is a bit too high. Now, the population size is fine, but if you keep fishing in that rate, you might have problems down the line. And so that metric they didn't like because as a result, with federal regulations and the way the Magnuson-Stevens Act is in place, they would have to cut the fishery in half to reduce the fishing rate down to what the stock assessment recommended. I delivered that assessment 1.5 years ago, and they're still deliberating what to do. So I don't know what to tell you. Then it's species specific, it's management board specific, or council specific, and it all depends on whether the answer is good or whether it's going to be a hard decision. Yeah. Sorry if does that answer your question? Yeah.
I was afraid that was the answer.
I saw his hand, and then I got a few more. Yeah.
A similar question in that when the rockfish season opens and tuna season opens, it always seems like the National Marine Fisheries for the Atlantic is waiting to the last minute to tell us what the slots are going to be, based upon the data. And I'm trying to figure out what data is just rolling in the last 24 hours that they got to make a decision so late before we can go fish.
Yeah. Who are you talking about? Specific fishery or in general?
Well, I think they manage tuna and they manage the rockfish. Those are the ones that I recall always coming out very early, very late in before the start of the fishing season.
Yeah, I'm not as familiar with what goes on with tuna. You're talking about rockfish, you're talking about striped bass?
Striped bass.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Because on the Pacific coast, that's a
yeah.
different fish. I can't really speak to tuna. Tuna is a really complicated one where there's a lot of international management going on. And so anytime you involve multiple states or multiple countries, it gets even more complicated and there's more delays. I really honestly don't know enough about the tuna fishery to know exactly how they set their regulations. I can speak for striped bass, that they're managed by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, my former boss. Striped bass, so we don't have strict deadlines with the ASMFC with regards to when we release the various management measures, whatever the new management measures might be. And so they're often running up to the deadline, not necessarily because there's new information coming in, but because they're deliberating over what the best thing to do is. And because there's 15 Atlantic states when it comes to striped bass, although Pennsylvania usually sits it out, they have to all kind of horse trade and figure out what the best solution will be for everyone, and that takes a long time. So it doesn't help you. But yeah, there's a lot of management decisions go into that, and a lot of arguing among states for these. So that's a stock where it's not just, we think about striped bass being Maryland and Virginia, right, here in the Chesapeake Bay, but it's actually states from Maine to Florida are involved in that decision, and they all have to come to an agreement together, and that can be really, really difficult because that stock is migratory, it goes out in the ocean, it comes in the bay, it does all sorts of things. So it makes it really complicated. I saw some ladies in here. You'll start.
When you're studying the size of a population, how do you have a sense that the samples you're taking are where the fish do or do not live? I mean, how do you know you're looking in the right place?
Oh, well, that's a great question. So some of our surveys where we're getting that kind of information, the scientists are going out and fishing, we're trying to get a broad array of places. So we're typically going out to where the ocean gets pretty deep along the edge, and we're trying to sample a wide variety. And hopefully hit or miss, if we get enough samples, we'll figure that out. But we've been wrong before. What was it? Which flounder was it that they had it completely missed them for years and thought they were gone?
Barn door skate.
Barn door skate, thank you. I knew there was one. So the survey went out for almost a decade, barely caught any. These are like a skate, like a ray, ray. And they didn't catch any. So they said, the fish are gone, the fish are gone. Well, it looks like they had just moved out of the area where we typically survey, up more towards Canada. Yeah. Yeah, we don't. And so that adds to the uncertainty in our assessments and the inaccuracy sometimes of our assessments. And so when we present these stock assessments to the managers, we say, okay, we think this is what is going on, but it all depends on these things being right. So yeah.
Given reports of surface seawater warming, are there any signs that that warming trend is taking place at lower levels? And if so, is it skewing your data on where fish populations are located?
So in the northwest Atlantic, so like our region north, we are seeing changes in where fish are showing up in high densities. And that shift is generally going a little bit north for many species. And we're starting to see species from the South Atlantic show up in our waters that never used to be there. We've got a fishery management plan starting for cobia now. We've seen red drum in the Chesapeake Bay, things that didn't happen before. That being said, in the South Atlantic, interestingly enough, we're not seeing a change in water temperature. We expected to see the same thing we did in the north, like from Maryland, let's say north. But if you look at water temperatures from about North Carolina to Florida, they've been actually relatively stable, which we didn't anticipate. And maybe because of where they are, I have no idea. I'm not an oceanographer, but it's not the same sort of phenomenon doesn't seem to be occurring. We're not sure why, but it's definitely happening in the Northeast. And to get to your question, we're actually, I keep bringing this up to some of our federal survey folks who run those surveys, that maybe we need to reconsider where we're surveying, because with climate change, we may not be hitting the center of the populations.
Does X-ray technology help you find the schools where like fish ponds?
So there are sonar surveys, yeah, where they're sending acoustic signals out to figure out. We don't have a lot of those on the East Coast. That's something they do a lot in Europe for like the herring fisheries. There's a there's an aerial survey for sardines in the Pacific. There's different methods for surveying besides just dragging a trawl net. And one of those includes a sonar equipment, yeah. But we don't use that too much on the East Coast, with a few exceptions. Oh, I saw her, and then... We still good?
Yeah, we'll give them
I was wondering if you could speak generally about where a majority of the funding comes from. Is it government-based? Does it come from businesses? Is it a mixed? And how sustainable is that? I mean, is this something that's in place for a good 20 years, or is that going to dwindle rapidly?
Yeah. So she asked, where does the funding come? I assume for the data collection and assessment? Yeah. Yeah.
Last time you'll volunteer to give it to us.
Oh my goodness.
Too many tough questions.
This is rough. Yes, there's a lag in the data. Yes, there's a lag in the advice. Oh my goodness, I'm sorry. Most of the funding, let's see, so it depends on where you are, but in general, most of the funding is coming through the congressional budget for the agency surveys and stock assessments. So the federal government through NOAA Fisheries has its own portion of the federal budget, and then the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, for instance, has money apportioned to it through NOAA directly from Congress. The states, though, set up their own budgets, and they're much lower, and that's one of the reasons why we don't have as many stock assessments for states as we do for the federal government. Not as much resources are devoted to them. Now, whether they are going to be, or how much of those resources are going to be around much longer, we'll see if we have a budget, right, in a month or two. So far, it looks like NOAA hasn't been cut too much. NOAA Fisheries. Now, NOAA Fisheries is under the Department of Commerce, because fishing is commerce, right? Commercial fishing is commerce. And there's some interesting history to that for the next talk, right? But that means that because it's business oriented, there's probably a good chance it will stick around. But we could use more.
Follow-up to that, I mean, is there any kind of an FDA link, since it's food that we eat or that we ship? And then,
I don't know about the FDA.
and is there
What was the
any
question?
incentive for businesses to kick in and cover that if, again, it's an entity that's regulated? I mean, is there an incentive for them to do their own surveys so that they're profitable later on?
Right. So she asked, to repeat the question, what about the FDA? What about, which I don't know about the FDA budget, but she did ask a good question, which is, are these commercial fisheries or recreational angling associations chipping in money to help get data and analyze the data? And we're seeing more and more of that, actually. There are a number of collaborative organizations between fishermen and academics actually popping up, one of which I do some work with. That's an NSF and fishermen collaborative where we come together, the fishermen fund. They put a pot of money in the fund and they say, we want to know more about menhaden. And then I say, well, I think the thing we really need to know about is blah, blah, blah. And they say, yeah, actually, that sounds interesting. And then they fund me to do the research, and they can't, what do you want to say, muzzle me? They can't say, don't publish that, right? Whereas if it was their own industry representative, they might say, no, no, don't publish that, it's not good news. So NSF is there to back me up to say, okay, this is good, publish it. So we're working, and then that, hopefully that science feeds into more sustainable fisheries, which means they have better profits and better, long-term businesses. So we're seeing more and more of that pop up. We're also seeing more and more volunteer data collection, just pro bono, no necessarily funds put into it, but pro bono work on the part of fishermen and anglers to collect data on the water. It's because we just can't get enough people out there. It's really expensive to put agency observers out on those boats. So we are seeing more and more of that because some of the really expensive stuff, the on-the-water sampling is getting really, really expensive to do.
Anytime you need me to go sampling for you.
We have a volunteer.
Make sure you leave me your name. You may have some births. Let's do one more question. Sure.
Is there a data bank to feed this into for the various species? So for instance, no matter who is collecting, I know when we were up in Provincetown and went out on a whale watch, there was what was cited on that ship, which was clearly a recreational kind of thing, but they could feed the data that they got from what we observed into a central database.
And this was observations of whales?
Right, this was for observation of whales, but I wondered if there was something for fish species that would do the same thing.
So you mean for volunteers or for official data collection?
Well, I was thinking even like, there are a lot of charter boats that go out.
Yeah,
things that,
okay. That's a very specific one. So the party charter boat fisheries are in this weird in-between place where they're not completely recreational and they're not completely commercial. Right. Technically, they're treated as recreational fisheries, but they're selling a product. Right. So they do have reporting requirements, actually. And it depends on the fishery, it depends on the location, but that data ends up in a big database, at least on the East Coast. We have a collaborative that collects all commercial fishery statistics and the for-hire recreational fishery statistics in one place, so that when Tom wants to do a study or the federal government needs to do a study, we can call them and say, look, we're doing this assessment, we need that data. So we are moving. It used to be you had to call 100 different people to get all that information, and now it's starting to become more and more localized. So yeah, we're moving in that direction.
All right. I'm sure you will stay around to answer any more questions.
And talk to you in the back.
Join me in thanking Jenny for a great talk.